Sotherbys, founded in England in 1744, is the world's leading fine arts auction house. Today, after almost 250 years, Sotheby's operates in 38 countries with more than 2,000 employees worldwide. In 1964, Sotheby's of London acquired the American auction house Park Burnett, launching a company policy of national growth with the opening of regional offices in major American cities, as well as international offices and representatives around the world. Exciting and glamorous auctions have been attracting huge crowds to the galleries, setting record prices that make headline news. Elegantly designed and informative catalogs and carefully mounted pre-sale exhibitions encourage the participation of private collectors in the auction process. Much has been said about the collecting of art, but very little about the care and conservation of these works, about the stewardship of these objects handed on from one generation to the next. In the following segments, Sotheby's experts will discuss and demonstrate for the collector the care and preservation of these works of art and antiques, those objects of which we are the custodians in our own time.
Behind me is the cabinet shop at Sotheby's Restoration. This is where all the property initially arrives. In the following segment, we'd like to show you some of the things that you can do at home to take care of your furniture. This is a very nice small Louis XV tulip wood marquetry commode. A lot of damage to furniture happens when it's moved from one location to the other, either in a house or on a moving truck. We'd like to show you the proper way of just moving a piece of cased furniture. First, we pick up the marble top off the frame and move it forward about a third of the distance. Stand it on end and carry it separately on the vertical. Marble is always carried vertically, never horizontally. When moving a piece of case furniture, it's necessary to grip it by the lowest part of the frame, tilt it slightly backwards as you lift it to avoid any chance of any of the drawers falling out, and carry it to its new location. This is a fine example of a Louis XVI gilt wood armchair, one of a set of 8 sold recently at auction in New York. Quite often this type of furniture is damaged in transit, either by professional movers or by the owners moving it at home because it's picked up improperly. You never pick it up by the cresting rail or by the arms. If the arms are loose, they could come off and the chair could fall. You approach it from the front, put your hands underneath the seat rail, lift it straight up, and carry it to its new location. A very important factor in maintaining any collection is keeping control of the temperature and humidity. What we're looking for is a constant temperature of around 68 to 72, and we're looking for humidity at around 52%. We have 2 types of gauges here. This small gauge doesn't record, but you can read on an hourly basis and see what the change in the temperature and humidity are. This gauge is a lot more expensive and a lot more elaborate, and it records on a piece of graph paper the exact temperature and the humidity at every hour throughout the day and the night. One of the principal tools in controlling the humidity, which is so critical, is a humidifier. On the right, we have the humidifier that should be used. It is a belt-driven machine that takes the air in, adds moisture to the air, and then pushes it back out. The machine on the left is a vaporizer. This simply shoots a stream of moisture into the air. It may be good for a very small area, but for large circulation, it serves no purpose at all. This is a George III mahogany card table and pretty well illustrates a couple of problems that happen because of climatic changes. This piece of wood came off the side of the table here. Every time this happens, you want to take the piece and put it in a plastic bag clearly marked with which piece of furniture it came from. The secondary problem here is the substructure of this table runs from right to left. The rich mahogany veneer is arched across the surface. As the substructure contracts and expands because of the change in humidity, the veneer becomes weak and falls off as it has here and over here. This is a George III satinwood Pembroke table, about 1790 in date, very elaborately inlaid with marquetry in the center and parquetry on the flaps. The problem here is because of the humidity or lack of humidity, it has developed two large cracks, one through the center parquetry panel, as you can clearly see, and the secondary crack runs along the edge right through the satinwood. It's very important that this be taken care of as soon as possible by a restorer. Particularly be careful when dusting a piece of furniture like that you don't snag on any of the loose pieces of marquetry and pick them up and lose them. We continually have inquiries about how to take care of antique brass on furniture. This is an example of a George III mahogany drawer front. As you can see, the handles are quite tarnished. In this case, we're going to take the handles off and clean them. To take the bolts off the back of the handles and the interior of the drawer lining, we have taken a pair of pliers, wrapped the end in masking tape so not to tear up the soft original brass, and slowly loosen the bolts. When they're loose enough to turn, we unscrew them by hand. Then push the post out through the front of the drawer, and the handle is detached. Now we are ready to put the brass handles into a mixture of warm, soapy ammonia and water. We allow it to settle in the mixture, then scrub it gently with a small brush made of horsehair, which does not scratch the surface. The mounts are then taken and rinsed in cold water, dried off, and are ready to be replaced on the piece of furniture. It is not always necessary to remove the brass handles to clean them. When the brasses are cleaned on the piece of furniture, we make a template that fits around the back plate so none of the cleaning agent gets on the wood and removes the finish. We then take a piece of raw cotton which has been saturated with a brass cleaning agent and gently rub the brass. When it is satisfactorily clean, we then wipe it down with a clean rag and remove any residue of the brass polish. Quite often we find gilt metal mounts on French and continental furniture. The mounts are made out of bronze and then covered with a thin layer of gold. They are cleaned in the same way as brass handles, but one has to be very careful not to scrub through the gold. This is a pair of 19th century French lions. The one on the right has been cleaned, the one on the left is the original finish on it. We continually get inquiries about problems with locks on furniture. This is a detail of the interior of an English drawer lining showing a traditional square brass lock. This lock would be single tumbler, and you turn the key once and it locks. To remove the lock, we take a piece of paper, do a diagram of the back plate, and remove each screw one at a time and place them where they should be on the diagram. This is to ensure that the screws go back into the same holes they came out of. Sometimes there's a variation in the drawer front depth. If you put the wrong screw in the wrong place, it may come out through the front surface of the drawer. We then remove the lock from the wooden frame, examine it carefully. As you can see, this is a very simple lock. And it's good at this point to use, since you've taken the lock off, to spray it with a little liquid oil and brush away some of the rust using a brass brush. Then wipe off the lock with a clean cloth and test it with the key to make sure it works before you go to the trouble of replacing it. The lock is then replaced where it belongs, using the screws going back in the same holes. This is the back of a French drawer lining, 18th century commode. As you can see, it's a rectangular lock plate as opposed to an English type lock plate, which would be square. Also, when you turn the key, it's a double tumbler. It turns twice to engage the lock. These locks are removed and cleaned in exactly the same way as the English locks, but one has to be a little more careful because they are much more sophisticated locking systems. One of the most common calls we get, usually first thing in the morning, is a complaint that after a dinner party they noticed they'd spilt wax on the dining table. The easiest way to take this off is either with a spatula or a credit card. Remove the candle out of the way, and taking the credit card at a down angle, gently scrape the wax off. By going with the grain, you're not going to scratch the surface of the wood. Then, with the residue removed from the table, you take a little distilled turpentine on a clean rag and go over the area where the residue of the wax is. Once this is done, it is necessary to re-wax the area that you've just removed the candle wax from. Then gently rub the area with a piece of cheesecloth. One of the more common questions we're asked is about water rings on surfaces. These are a typical example of rings left on a dining room table. And these are dark rings left on the surface of this mahogany tray. The dark rings are much more difficult to get out and should be left to a professional. We use a little paste wax and 4-0 steel wool. That's 0000, the finest steel wool made. Rub gently with the grain back and forth over the affected area, and the mark should be lifted out. Then buff it with a piece of cheesecloth, again going with the grain, and the rings should disappear. If this treatment doesn't work, you really should consult a professional restorer. One thing that is never used on fine furniture is any type of spray. Most of these contain silicone, and with prolonged use, you will notice a slight grayish haze develop on the wood. The other thing is that when you finish using it, you will feel an oily texture to the wood. This attracts dust and dirt. One of the most important things you can do at home to take care of your antique furniture is to keep it waxed. This is usually done twice a year, and the best time to do it is in the spring and again in the fall. This is a George III mahogany sideboard, about 1790, with a beautiful colored top. Now what Bill is doing is applying the wax, the paste wax, in a circular motion into the grain of the wood. When he's finished doing the circles, he'll straighten it out and again go with the grain of the wood straight across. When he's finished the waxing, he'll take a clean piece of cheesecloth and go over the surface, working the residue of wax into the grain. This waxing produces a deep sheen and also protects the surface of the wood from any foreign objects. Now that we understand how to wax a flat surface, as in a dining table, the next problem is how to handle a chair like this that's elaborately carved. This is made about 1770, English Chippendale, and has elaborately carved back. Using a stenciling brush and paste wax, we work the wax into the brush and then work it into the wood, concentrating on the carved areas. Using this brush allows us to get into all the cracks and crannies in the wood, and thereby feeding the wood with the wax. Once this is done, we use a fine quality, long-haired shoe brush and buff down the areas we've waxed, particularly working on the carved areas. Then we go over the whole piece with a clean cheesecloth and bring up the luster in the wood. This segment of taking care of your furniture at home obviously covers a very small part of a large, complicated subject. We have endeavored to show you some of the things to do and not to do. Remember some of the rules. Never use any sprays on your furniture. Use paste wax probably twice a year. Be careful of direct sunlight and take care of the surfaces.
Chances are you don't have as many carpets at home as we have here in our warehouse. In this segment, we're going to be talking about how to care for and maintain the carpets and textiles that you do have in order that they might become antiques, as a lot of the rugs are, which you see here. There are many types and shapes of carpets which are woven in different areas, in different techniques, with different materials, which include wool, silk, and cotton. Each of these techniques of weaving and materials employed require a different kind of caring for and maintenance in order to ensure a long life. Here we're looking at a Lori Pambat Kazakh rug from the Southwest Caucasus, which is constructed all out of wool, and the care and maintenance of this carpet would be different than that for the Sotherbys carpet from Northwest Persia, which is made entirely out of silk. This is a Kuba kilim, also woven in the Caucasus. However, it's woven in a slit tapestry technique, which is a technique also employed in European workshops such as Obasan and the Bessarabian work, and this requires a different kind of care than the pile carpets. Other more fragile or delicate textiles you might have around the house include needlepoint rugs, needlepoint used to upholster furniture, or cushions, tapestries, and embroideries. As carpets are used on the floor, they're obviously subject to wear. Uneven wear patterns can result when a carpet stays in the same position in a room over a long period of time. In order to avoid this, it is best to rotate a carpet every year or so to even out the wear patterns. As you can see on the carpet here, one end of the carpet is considerably more worn than the other. It is so worn that it is even beginning to split. The other end of the carpet retains much of its original pile, and this uneven wear pattern could have easily been avoided by turning the carpet. All textiles and carpets are subject to fading by the light. There is no way to prevent some fading unless they are kept in total darkness. As this is not possible, it is recommended that carpets and textiles are kept away from direct, intense sunlight, and for larger carpets, again, rotation will help even out the fading patterns. In order to prevent animal stains from permanently damaging your carpet, you should rinse them thoroughly with warm water before they have had a chance to dry. Unlike other stains, once an animal stain has dried into a carpet, it is impossible to remove. All carpets and textiles should be kept away from humidity and in a dry place. Humidity will eventually cause the fibers, whether they are silk or wool, to break and crack, as we can see in this carpet here. The rugs and tapestries we've been looking at today are all handmade. Therefore, they all have slight imperfections. One of these imperfections is that they are not straight on all four sides. In order to hang a rug or tapestry so that it will lie straight against a wall with equal tension over the surface, we've found that the best way is by attaching a piece of Velcro to the wall and sewing a piece of Velcro to the top back of a rug or tapestry. Thereby, when you place the rug or tapestry on the wall, you can adjust the top of the rug or tapestry to obtain equal tension over the surface, and it will lie flat. This is also very easy for removing the rug or tapestry should you ever need to do so. To prolong the life of your rug or carpet, we would recommend using a thin carpet pad such as this, which will cause friction between the carpet and the floor on which it is lying, and take up some of the natural unevenness of the carpet, which causes uneven wear. We would also recommend the use of caster cups under heavy pieces of furniture, as these help equally distribute the weight of the furniture over the surface of the carpet. On a day-to-day basis, you should vacuum your carpets with a suction vacuum, not a power brush vacuum, and yearly or every 2 years you should have them professionally cleaned. In order to clean more delicate fabrics such as needlepoint upholstery on furniture, we recommend using a suction vacuum over a netting, which will remove the dirt from the needlepoint without damaging the needlepoint. Another reason to regularly vacuum and periodically have your carpets cleaned is to prevent moth damage. Moths will eat wool, and as you can see on the carpet here, they've eaten away the pile from the surface of the carpet. If you need to store a carpet or textile for an extended period of time, it should be rolled on a pole, and for pile carpets, they should be rolled with the pile facing out. This means you will need to flip the carpet over and roll it so that the pile is out, which causes less tension on the foundation fibers. Once the carpet has been rolled, it should be wrapped, preferably with mothballs, and tied, and stored in a cool, dry place. This will ensure that there are no problems with damp, such as dry rot. If you ever have any doubts or questions about cleaning any of your carpets or textiles, especially fragile objects, you should always consult a professional.
Everybody has a book, a piece of paper, and that's just the problem in dealing with rare books and manuscripts. They're not ordinary books. They're not ordinary pieces of paper. They have to be treated differently. An ordinary book is for reading. A rare book is for studying and for preserving. Take these books behind me, for example. These aren't distinguished by their contents as being rare, but they have beautiful leather bindings. They have to be looked after properly. One of the first things that you have to know is how to take a book off a shelf. For example, the worst thing of all is to try and pull a book off by the head of its spine. You're going to cause problems, you're going to chip the head, you may pull it off. Always try and reach behind the book and pull from the back of the book and pull it forward. If the books are so tightly wedged together or there's no space above the books, what you might want to do is hold the book you want to pull out and just push the books on either side and then pull the book out. And that's going to not damage the book as you withdraw it from the shelf. Bookshelves are valuable space in your house, I know that, but be careful about rare books. Don't pack them in too tightly. If you do, they're going to be hard to pull out. They may get damaged as you do. This is about right. You can jiggle them a little bit. And by the way, keep large books with large books and small books with small books. It's a better idea. A lot of people have large, strong hands, and so it's very tempting to pull out more than one book at a time from a shelf. To take a whole pile, it's so much quicker and easier. It's also easy to drop a few of them. It's just not a good idea. Take them out one at a time. You can see why books need to be looked after properly. Here's a pile that's a complete disaster. These books have been maltreated in all sorts of different ways. For example, they've clearly been kept in the wrong kind of atmosphere. Much, much too dry. I mean, look at this book here, for example. The binding, it's a leather binding. It's completely flaking away. Much, much too dry was the atmosphere in which it was maintained. You want to keep books in an atmosphere where the relative humidity is about the same as is good for human beings, about 50 to 60%. These books look like they've been kept up in the attic. There's a lot of other problems with these books, too. They should be cradled properly. Any book should be cradled properly when it's opened. You want to hold the covers firmly so they don't flop open. In this case, the book seems to have flopped open much, much too much. Look, the binding is completely cut all the way through there. Now, these books, if they'd been properly looked after, would be in fine shape. The paper inside's in beautiful condition, nice and white. These books date from the early 19th century, but they haven't been looked after at all, and hence the condition is a disaster. This is a book that's been repaired with tape. I don't think I really need to say that this is not a good idea. Do not repair a book with tape. Have a professional conservator look after a good book. Here's another book which clearly is lacking in proper oiling, and it's been allowed to dry out to such an extent that though it's a very pretty binding, a 19th century binding, the hinge is completely broken and the upper cover is now totally loose. It's a great shame, can be restored to some extent, but it's best never to let it happen by not letting your books dry out. Here are some other things not to do. Don't put acidic paper inside books. Now, most paper is acidic, and what's especially acidic is any newspaper. Here there are some bits of paper which are clearly acidic. Look how it's browned. And that will eventually leach into this nice 19th century, early 19th century paper here and damage it. So be careful about that. Also, when you're dealing with books, and manuscripts for that matter, and you're wearing jewelry, be careful to take it off so that you don't chip the paper or the bindings. Here are some examples of how to care for books properly. This is a first edition of C.S. Lewis's Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. Now, it looks rather like a reading book, but because it's a first edition, it's really very valuable. And it's particularly desirable because it's got its original dust jacket. The dust jacket has been preserved by putting cellophane over it. This should be done professionally, but it's meant that the dust jacket is not going to deteriorate further, and that has a great deal to do with the value of 20th century books. This is an example of Hemingway's first book. It's extremely fragile because it only has paper wrappers, and yet this particular copy is in absolutely pristine condition, and it's going to stay that way because it's kept inside a chemise, and that in turn is kept inside a slipcase, and it's just not going to get damaged by rough handling because of that. And then a third book that I have here is the first edition of Dracula from the late 19th century. It's not in the most beautiful condition, but it's still very desirable. It's a very rare book, and to have it in this kind of condition still makes it really quite valuable. You want to be very careful it doesn't deteriorate any further, and the way this has been done in this case is to provide the book with a folding box, and the folding box will take care of the book, protect it from any kind of rough handling and from dust. It's important to dust and oil your books. Now, this book here has a lot of dust that's accumulated on its top. You just rub it off with lightly with a very soft cloth or with a brush away from the spine so that you're not forcing it back towards the spine. Hold the book closed so that you're not forcing the dust into the pages too. And in this case, this book here is gilded at the top, and that is not just for decorative reasons. That's also to keep the dust out of the pages, prevent the dust from falling down between the pages. Now, obviously, the only books that need to be oiled are leather-bound books, but it's really quite important for their preservation. If they're not oiled, they eventually become dry, brittle, and crack. Now, it's a pretty simple process. We use a combination of lanolin and neatsfoot oil. You just take a little bit on a very soft cloth, and you wipe it on the leather very gently, just a very thin, smooth coating. In this case, the binding is both leather and cloth. You've got to be very careful not to put any of the oil on the cloth. It's going to stain the cloth. So just wipe the leather gently with the oil all the way through. The corners also in this case, but not inside where they could touch the pages. And then let the oil dry overnight. The leather will absorb it. Stand the book on its edges like that. Leave it overnight. In the morning, it should be ready to go back in the bookshelves. Now, depending on the environment, this should happen about once every year to 3 years. In the Northeast, with its dry interiors, perhaps every year. You can tell when you need to do it. Just look at the bindings. If they have a flat look, no longer have that nice sheen to them, they probably need to be oiled. If they feel dry to the touch, they probably need to be oiled. Now, I like this process. I think it's a wonderful thing to do. The smell of the lanolin and the neatsfoot oil just smells like a good binding. It's a very satisfying project to oil your books. Paper and leather are extremely susceptible to damage from sunlight. You can see in these books here, which have leather bindings, how the sunlight has damaged them. In this case, the spine has been discolored to this dark brown, whereas in fact the leather was originally this bright green here. The sunlight will also dry out the leather and cause it to flake and require more oiling than it might otherwise require. It's extremely damaging. You have to be careful to keep your books in a filtered or light-filtered environment. It may seem obvious that you don't write in rare books, but in fact sometimes it's necessary to put in a few notations about where the book was purchased or how it came to you, and that's permissible if you do it in a light pencil on the blank end papers. At the same time, there may be other notations there. Don't erase them. They're important. They tell you about where the book came from. And also, at the same time, don't take out old book plates. They're also significant examples of provenance of the book. Manuscripts, like books, require care and preservation. Be sensible about the way you look after manuscripts. For example, direct sunlight can be very damaging. I remember a client who brought in a George Washington letter, which had been hanging in the family dining room for the last 30 years in direct sunlight. And they'd never noticed it, but over the years, the writing had practically faded away. It was written almost in invisible ink by the time it came to us, and it had lost almost all its value. It was a great tragedy, in fact. I have here a Benjamin Franklin letter. You can see his wonderful signature here. It's not being cared for well, though. It's got what looks like masking tape on the back of it, where there are some breaks in the creases of the folds. That's absolutely unforgivable. Should never happen. But at least one thing is right about this. It's being stored flat now, and it should be stored flat. Manuscripts should not be kept folded up. This paper is also very, very brittle, and you can see how it's already beginning to break at some of the edges. So for now, it's stored inside this acetate folder, and that should protect it properly. Don't use tape, don't use pins, don't use staples, don't use paper clips on manuscripts. All of them can damage the manuscripts over time. Paper clips often corrode and rust, and we find many manuscripts with the shadows of paper clips that were left on them for a year or two too long. Here's an example of a Henry Miller manuscript, a 20th century manuscript, where pins have been used to keep the pages together. Look how they've been damaged. Again, not a very good idea. Many people like to frame their manuscripts, but here's an example of a really bad way to do it. The mat board that's been used is clearly very acidic. You can see how orange it is here, and that's stained the manuscript that's been framed underneath it. You can see the edging, how it's been staining there. And I'm sure that underneath the manuscript there is some sort of very acidic cardboard, and you can see how it's staining the whole piece of paper here orange. If you're going to frame up a manuscript, do it to museum standards and do it with acid-free mats. In the 19th century, it was often customary to paste manuscripts into albums. That would be considered unforgivable. But here's an example of a 19th century album in which a manuscript by Walt Whitman has been pasted down. It's a wonderful manuscript. It's about the death of Abraham Lincoln. But you can see how dangerous this is. The paper on which the manuscript is pasted is slowly turning yellow. It's going to affect the manuscript. Nowadays, we'd never do something like that. We'd store our manuscripts in acid-free folders, and they'll last for generations that way. You may feel tempted to do your own repairs on rare books and manuscripts. Please don't. It's not a good idea. You must consult a proper conservator before you do anything. And often, in fact, the best restoration is no restoration at all.
There's an old French epigram that says the history of ceramics is the history of all mankind. But what are ceramics? Ceramics are pottery and porcelain. Pottery being the earliest form of vessels made and fired by man, porcelain being something a little more sophisticated. Porcelain vessels were made earliest in China and sought after desperately by the Europeans, who by 1710 had finally found the secret of making hard paste porcelain. Hard paste is true porcelain, and it was made first in Germany, then in Italy, and on into the other countries. The other form of porcelain is soft paste, and soft paste was the first kind of experimental porcelain made first in Italy, and then in France, and finally in England, where it is still made today as bone china. Those are basically the kinds of pottery and porcelain, but how do we handle them? This is what we will find out next. In handling ceramics, remember that everything's breakable, but don't let that scare you. Don't get nervous just because you think you're going to drop a piece. Just keep calm and by all means keep things clean. Now, as you prepare to clean things or handle things, you should remove all jewelry because it will scratch or even break a piece. Take off your dangly necklaces. Those can catch on the extremities of a piece. Get your hair out of your eyes, even if it isn't fashionable, and wear nice tight cuffs, not loose cuffs, because they can catch on covers or handles and spin a piece around and right off of the table or the shelf. Now, before picking something up, you want to examine it for any kind of damage. Something may look quite perfect to you, but if you get up close, you can see that there's a little chip or a little crack, or in fact, a great big restoration. For instance, with this dish, it looks yellow and you think maybe you have to wash it. In fact, it's completely restored. We've scraped away the part of the dish that wasn't restored so that you can see how originally white it was. And all of this yellow business is restoration. Now, when you come across a restoration like that, you know it's an area that you can't pick up a piece by. So don't pick up a plate by its rim for fear you might actually be picking up a big chunk of restoration. And always handle things with both hands so that if something begins to go, you can catch it with the other hand. Now, when you're picking up one thing alone, such as, let's say, a teapot, is that you never want to handle it by the handle and spout, even though that's the most obvious place to pick it up. This teapot looks quite all right until you spin it around and find out that the entire spout has been off and in fact chipped at the end. So if you pick this one up by its handle and spout, you'd be probably in deep trouble. So what you want to do is cradle it in both hands, hang on to the cover, and if you're ever walking alone out of a room and you have a collision, you want your hand to be preceding the object so that your hand takes the hit and not the breakable object. In packing anything to move it across the room or across the country, you want to make perfectly sure that everything is very well protected. Now, some people like to wrap all the extremities very tightly, but we've discovered that the best way is to pad these parts rather simply. So the first thing you want to do is to remove the cover from such as a teapot, then take tissue paper, fold up and wrapped around like this so that there's a bit of space between the paper and what will come next. A fresh piece of tissue, or as many as you need. And then at the end, a wonderful piece of bubble wrap which really cushions it for whatever blows might occur. Now, when you pack a cover, pack it separately, but be sure to mark it that it is a piece that is supposed to be unpacked, because otherwise it's entirely possible that the recipient will not realize that the cover existed. So make 2 packages, but mark them both. In packing flat pieces such as plates, the best thing to do is to pack them on their sides, not one on top of another. Have a box that's well padded on all sides, and then wrap each plate individually, which we haven't done here, simply for a demonstration of what they should look like, with lots of padding in between. Don't stack them on top of each other, because the ones on the bottom will take a great deal of weight from those on the top, and the rattling of the move could cause serious damage. This is an example of what happens when you don't stack things on their sides, when you pack one piece on top of another with virtually no packing paper in between. It's not what you want to find when you open the box. In storing pieces, don't overcrowd the shelves. Put the smaller pieces in front of the larger pieces to ensure clear visibility, and put the things you use the most often at the front of the shelves. Don't overstack, and be sure nothing protrudes from the edge of the shelf. In carrying cups, this is the method punishable by death. Clearly, you've got the most vulnerable part over each finger, and each cup is hitting the other one. Do try to pick up the cup solidly in your hand. Now, in storing it, equal punishment by death is the 4-cup method. That just is asking for trouble, like the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Try to stack them no more than one at a time, and if you can, put a little piece of paper towel or tissue paper between so that the decoration on the outside of the top cup doesn't get rubbed off by the rim of the lower cup. In stacking plates, remember not to stack them too high, because pottery and porcelain plates can be extremely heavy, and the pour plate on the bottom takes all the weight. Now, also something to remember is that the foot rim on any piece of pottery or porcelain tends to be quite rough. It's unglazed, and it can actually wear the enamels and the glaze on the top of the plate below it. So put a pad between each piece. Sometimes a dealer or a store will provide you with a pad, a nice soft napkin-like pad. But if not, you can go to the 10-cent store and buy some felt and cut it into pad shape. You can chop up an old blanket and do the same thing. You might have some pads left over from a move that you could slide in between. And this kind of styrofoam is wonderful for padding. It's very resilient. My favorite, however, is the one where the woman loved the plates so much that she simply had to fancy them up and crochet her own pads. If you have plates that you have hung on the wall, which isn't where they're meant to be, but if you do have such a thing with metal hangers such as these, be awfully careful in removing the hangers because you can cause chips as the metal runs off of the edge of this very chippable glaze. Now be sure never to stack a plate with a hanger attached to it, because that hanger will of course damage the piece underneath it. And if you possibly can, get smaller hangers that you can buy at almost any hardware store and pad the little metal ends with some form of cotton or plastic wrapping so that when you do pull the hanger off, it will not damage the rim of the plate. You may have an occasion to label a piece of pottery or porcelain, but be very careful about enameled surfaces. Often the enamels have not been fired on terribly hard, and a gummy or sticky label will actually pull them straight off. More dangerous still is the use of a gummy label or a sticker on anything with gilding, because the gilding is fired at the lowest possible temperature and is the first thing to come off. As you can see on the knob of this piece, the gilding is gone, leaving its sizing underneath. And it's very sad because that old gilding can never be completely replaced. So if you have to label something, possibly the best way to do it is to tie a tag onto a piece, or certainly put your sticky label on an area where there's no decoration. The temptation in displaying any piece with a cover is to lash the cover down with a piece of sticky tape so that it doesn't fly off if you're dusting it or moving it around. Not a very good idea because the sticky tape can actually remove the enamels and the gilding if the edge has gilding. There are substances that are much better that you can buy at the hardware store quite easily. And you take a little tiny glob of them and put them on the inside of the rim of the teapot where they really won't show, and then anchor the cover down. They don't harden so that your cover is permanently in place, but they do keep the cover from flapping around if in fact the feather duster gets a little bit busy. Washing your pottery and porcelain is of greatest concern. The air that gets your pieces dirty is the same air we breathe, and it's no better for your lungs than it is for your pieces of pottery and porcelain. Now, if you've given a dinner party and there's food on the underside of the plates, make sure that is off, because that actually may have acid in it that can cause stains on pieces, on the top of a piece or on the bottom. Now, the dishwasher is the great question. What can I put in the dishwasher? Well, anything modern can probably withstand the hot water and the abrasive action of the detergent, but an old piece really cannot stand that kind of action. It's not fired in the same way, and the enamels are much less permanent, and the gilding much more likely to be washed away in the hot water and in the abrasive detergent. So be very careful, and anything you cherish, wash by hand. When washing pieces by hand, the best method is to use a rubber dishpan because it is resilient. But if you are just using your sink, then try to find a piece of foam rubber to put on the bottom, or wad up some towels so that if you drop a piece or it slips, it won't break at the bottom of the sink. Now, you can use warm water, not terribly boiling hot water, whatever your hands can stand. And don't scrub too hard, because you can scrub either broken bits off or little pieces of enamel, and of course the gilding is going to have a hard time with the scrubbing. Now, you can use regular soap or dishwashing liquids and a soft brush or a soft sponge. When you dry the piece, use a soft towel, or if you let the piece dry in the air, that's fine, but if it's a dish and you're stacking it on top of others, make sure it's completely dry. Otherwise, the moisture may form a vacuum and the pieces will stick together when you try to remove them from the shelf. If you're planning to wash a rather complicated piece with extremities, you want to make sure first, before you attack it with water, that there are no restorations or loose bits. Now, in this particular instance, the entire arm of Venus is restored, so you want to be very careful about how you go about washing that. Now, the first thing to remember is not to use rubber gloves on complicated pieces. They're fine for dishes and plates, but they have a tendency to stick. And if a piece is restored, a sticking rubber glove can pull off a little bit of the restoration. If you think you're perfectly okay and there are no restorations here, then there's no reason you shouldn't just swish the piece in water. Perhaps if it's very dirty, leave it for a while and then bring it back up and rinse it. If you have a spray in your sink, so much the better. If not, just run very lightly hot water over it to get the soap suds off of it. Now, if it's really a filthy piece, then the answer is one of your household cleaners, which are good for cutting grease. And I can show you what happens with a paper towel or a soft cloth or a sponge and household cleaner. You get the most amazing amount of dirt away. And it's also very good for polishing up the gilding. So any kind of household cleaner, perhaps that better than a glass cleaner, will bring up the gilding. Now, if there are areas that you can't reach with your fingers in a paper towel, you can always use cotton swabs and get between feet or in the little flowers, something along that line. Now, also, if you're drying this, you don't want to rub a towel over it because, again, the vulnerable points could chip. So you might want to take a hairdryer and blow the water away and let it dry in that fashion. Some pieces may simply appear uncleanable. These two pieces, the sauceboat and mug, are actually made out of the same type of clay. But the mug has gone through perhaps the oven or certainly some hot liquids, and the glaze has allowed the pottery beneath to discolor. It's not something you should try to bleach with your normal household bleach. It really is the job for a restorer who has a special solution that can turn the mug as lovely and white as the sauceboat. So just remember, when you're handling ceramics, don't hurry. Haste makes waste, and waste makes accidents. Now, if accidents do happen, and they will, just scoop up the bits, and if you can't put them together yourself with water-soluble glue, then take them to a professional restorer and get a proper job done. But in all things, use common sense. It won't ever fail you. And in handling the possessions you cherish, remember you're preserving the past for the future.
I'm going to be talking to you about the home care of clocks. The two basic types of clocks that we're going to be talking about are table or bracket clocks, like the two in front of me, which are spring-driven, or tall case or grandfather clocks, like the regulator behind me, which is weight-driven. First, I'd like to talk about the care of the exterior of the case of the bracket clocks in front of me. Both of these clocks are ebonized, which means they are made from a fruit wood which has been stained and polished to look like ebony. The method of care of these or of plain wooden cases will be the same. The best thing that you can do is to wax a clock like this with a good paste wax once or twice a year, and in the interim, just brush it off with a soft brush or cloth. The brass handles and finials that you see on these two clocks originally probably had been treated with a colored lacquer to make them look a little bit more like gold. Consequently, you don't want to rub them with steel wool or an ammoniated cleaner or brass cleaner, because that will take off all of the color that's on them. It is best also just to wax these things with a little bit of wax and brush them off with a soft cloth when they're dirty. If you have to move a table or bracket clock, the one thing you never want to do is pick it up only from the handle at the top. I'm using here a clock that's had the movement removed from the case, so it's relatively light and one can lift it with one hand. However, when the movement is in the clock, you've got something that weighs 15 or 20 pounds. Consequently, it's putting a lot of pressure on the handle, which is bolted through the top of the case by two bolts with nuts on the bottom, and that is not what comes loose. After 200 years, very often, the glue around the top of the case will come loose and the entire top will separate from the bottom part of the case. If you have to move a clock like this, the absolute best way is to pick it up with two hands from underneath the case. If for one reason or another this is not practical, you can put one hand on the handle, but always, always support the case from underneath with your other hand. This is the dial of a bracket or table clock. The various elements here are the chapter ring, subsidiary dials, spandrels, and center. The chapter ring is made from a piece of brass which has been silvered, and the numerals are filled with black wax. There really is no home method for cleaning this, because even with the mildest silver polish, there is a very good chance that you're going to take off what little bit of silvering is left on this, leaving you with exposed brass, which of course will tarnish, as is evidenced in some of these smaller subsidiary dials. The gilt bronze or brass parts are not unlike the brass finials and handles we looked at on the outside of the case. They either have gilding or colored lacquer applied to them, both to keep them from tarnishing and to make them look more like gold. So any rubbing with brass polish or any kind of abrasive surface is going to take off the coating that's on them, leaving you with a brass surface which for sure will tarnish. So it's best to have the dial restored or cleaned by a competent clockmaker. Next, a word about winding and setting spring-driven table and bracket clocks. Because these are mechanical things, many people are afraid of them. But a clock like this has been around for 250 years and still runs just fine, so there's really nothing to be particularly afraid of. When you're going to wind the clock, fit the key or winder over the winding square carefully. This is especially important, not so much with a brass dial clock, but with a painted dial or enamel dial clock, the edges around the winding square will chip very easily if you kind of miss the square. Most table and bracket clocks are 8-day duration, and these clocks will almost always wind in a clockwise direction. So that if you just slip the winder over the winding square, turn it slowly until it stops. All of these spring-driven clocks have a stop. They really cannot be overwound. In order to set the clock, the best method is to put your finger on the center of the minute hand and turn only in a clockwise direction, never counterclockwise. If the clock comes to the hour, or in the case of this clock, which is quarter striking, to one of the quarter hours, and it strikes, you must stop until it is finished striking completely and then continue along to the next quarter. Move the minute hand in a clockwise direction thusly until the desired hour is found. A most important consideration in moving a bracket or table clock is stabilizing the pendulum before you begin. On this clock, we have a backplate which has a hook on the lower right-hand side which accepts the pendulum and will not let it flop back and forth. It is important that this be done before moving the clock to avoid damage to the suspension spring or crutch. Many other types of bracket clocks will have a screw that will press the pendulum against the backplate. If you have a clock that has neither one of these devices, an acceptable method is to put a piece of masking tape over the pendulum attached to both sides on the backplate until you've accomplished the movement you desire. The care of the case of grandfather weight-driven tall case clocks is as you'd expect for any fine piece of furniture. These clocks should be waxed once or twice a year with a good quality paste wax and rubbed with a soft brush or cloth. in the interim dusted with a soft brush or cloth. It's very important that a stable environment of temperature and humidity be encouraged, and that the clock not be set up near or over a heat register or next to a radiator. In setting up a tall case weight-driven clock, the most important thing that you can do is affix the clock to the wall. In the case of this clock that we have here, you can see a number of holes in the back plate of the case where a screw went through the back plate into a molly in the wall. When a clock like this is fully wound, the weights are up in the top, combined with the weight of the movement, make a tall case clock very top-heavy, and unless it's affixed to the wall, it has a great tendency to topple forward. If it becomes necessary to move a tall case clock, it's important first to disattach it from the wall and take it to its individual components. This involves removing the weights from the pulleys, the pendulum from the movement, then the hood is taken off the clock and the movement is taken out. In order to facilitate this, it is necessary that the weights be at the bottom of the case, which means that the movement is completely run down. This is the back plate of the movement of the tall case clock, showing the pendulum rod, the suspension spring, and the pendulum crutch. In order to remove the pendulum from the clock, grasp the rod, lifting slightly to remove the suspension spring from the suspension block, and pull directly backwards in order to release the block at the top of the pendulum rod from the crutch. It is important not to bend the crutch in any way when you're removing the pendulum block. Winding regulation and setting of the tall case clock. The winder is fit over the winding square. In most tall case clocks, the winder is turned in a clockwise direction slowly. At the same time, you will see that the weight is rising in the case, and this is best, of course, done with the door open. There will be a stop when the weight is fully wound to the top, and at that point, it is imperative that you stop turning the winder and then move to the other winding square and repeat the process. To set the time on the tall case clock, the minute hand is moved always in a clockwise direction, preferably with your finger at the center of the hand. When you reach the hour, it is best to let the clock strike fully before continuing upon the rotation to the next hour. To regulate the speed of a tall case clock, or for that matter, a spring-driven table or bracket clock, the pendulum is either lengthened or shortened depending upon the speed with which the clock is running. This is done by stopping the pendulum and rotating the knurled knob underneath the pendulum bob in a clockwise direction to raise the pendulum if the clock is running too slow, and in a counterclockwise direction to lower the pendulum if it's running too fast. Please remember, these are clocks. They are mechanical devices, and they're not meant to be intimidating. However, if there is a problem with the clock running or excessive regulation problems, always consult a qualified clockmaker.
I remember an interesting exhibition in London in the late 60s of fantastic English silver from the Kremlin in Moscow. The curious thing about this exhibition was that they did not clean the silver. Their policy was not to clean it. They said that if they cleaned it, it would be worn out like our Western silver by constant polishing. Theirs, on the other hand, uncleaned, untouched, would remain pristine. The public's reaction was glum, and I'm glad to say that the Russians have, like us, returned the silver polish bottle and the duster to bring the silver up to the right luster and to the life and character that it gets from being constantly polished and looked after. The table you see here is set for a particularly grand dinner party. It shows the stylistic changes in fashion in English silver from about 1750 through to 1850. The styles encompass the rich Rococo, strict neoclassical, handsome Regency, and through to the Rococo revival again. Amongst the coats of arms are those of the Earl of Harwood, the Earl of Thanet, and the Earl of Dudley. Obviously, somebody very important is coming to dinner tonight, possibly its mother-in-law, and we know how critical she is going to be if the silver isn't spotlessly clean. Almost nobody likes to clean silver. Some even profess, or perhaps I should say pretend, to be allergic to the cleaning agents. Perhaps the best advice of all I can give you is to give the job to somebody else. But if you're not in that happy position, then I suggest that you clean the silver as little as possible, that is to say, as little as is consistent with the metal still looking bright and clean. There are so many methods of cleaning silver to choose from. A lady client of ours, quite a serious collector, uses a bath of water with spick and span and a strip of aluminum foil, with, she claims, very satisfactory results. On the whole, we wouldn't recommend that formula. There are many choices of cleaning agents on the open market, from regular polishes to silver foams. The Goldsmiths Hall in London uses a silver foam for regular cleaning. Some museums still like to use a mixture of jeweler's rouge with alcohol, sometimes mixed with a bit of ammonia, for their earliest silver. But whatever polish you decide to use, do be careful always to rinse the piece after cleaning very thoroughly, and also dry it equally thoroughly. And it might be helpful here to use a regular electric hairdryer. The use of silver dip is a controversial subject. We think it's perfectly all right to use it for things such as spoons and forks, and it's particularly beneficial for removing egg stains, which are quite hard to remove by regular polishing methods. Do remember this, though. Only immerse the piece for the briefest possible period, 30 seconds should be more than enough, and rinse it very thoroughly in cool water afterwards. After the use of dip, one really does need to get a polish onto the object, and a piece like this plain teapot will take a lot of polishing. It would be very hard to damage the surface. The beauty of this teapot, which happens to be designed by Henning Kopel and sold by George Jensen, is its reflective surface and its very streamlined contours made in the 50s. The only thing to be careful of here is try to keep the polish away from the wood handle, which equally should not be immersed in water. Try to keep the handle above the level of the water, otherwise the handle will be stained and will eventually separate from its sockets. This is another object which will take a lot of hand polishing. There's no intricate detail to abrade or to wear out. The beauty of this piece rests really in the play of light on its contours and its lobes and flutes. Note that, like the preceding teapot, it has a wood handle, in this case an exotic hardwood, and that wood has been used also for the finial on the top. If you're a fastidious cleaner, you can unscrew the finial on the top, which is secured by a wing nut inside, and after cleaning, replace it. This little teapot stand made in the late 18th century is exactly the sort of piece which should get as little cleaning as possible. The whole appeal of this piece is its bright cut engraving. The metal is engraved at an angle, cut at an angle, so that it reflects the light. When that has gone, the appeal of the object is more or less gone too. The perspicacious here will notice that the monogram perhaps is not of the period in the center of the piece, but that is a small penalty for an otherwise choice piece. Behind it is a piece where the engraving really has been worn, almost totally away by polishing. This is an earlier sugar box of the 1720s, and the decoration has now almost vanished through heavy-handed cleaning. That is true both of the decoration on the cover and indeed of the coat of arms on the front here. Just as it's extremely important to protect the surface decoration of a piece from too much polishing and rubbing, so it's of paramount importance to protect the marks. A large part of the value of this George I silver salver rests in its marks. Fortunately, they've been struck on the back side of the salver rather than on the top, in a position where they don't really get very much wear. Nonetheless, when cleaning silver like this, do try not to rub the marks at all. As it stands, these marks are in pristine condition and tell you all that you need to know about the salver. On the left, you have the maker's mark of Paul de Lamery, Next, you have the London mark, which is the lion's head erased. Next to that is the figure of Britannia. This shows, of course, that the salver is made of a higher than sterling silver. And the last mark is the date letter G, in this case for the year 1722. Once you damage those marks or rub them, a large proportion of the interest of this fine piece of silver is gone. This is a piece which needs a little extra help. As you can see, it's a very intricate object indeed. It's made by the royal goldsmiths, the Garrards, in the beginning of this century, but after a 16th century original. It's made of a combination of cast metal, chased metal, and some embossing. To aid in cleaning this, and particularly to get the residue of polish out of the crevices, a plate brush can be a handy tool. Plate brushes used to be a thing of the past, and people would complain that they were unavailable. They are generally available now. Make sure the bristles are really soft. Similarly, when using a sponge or cloth, it must be the softest possible fabric. There are various degrees of cleanliness in silver, and I think most people will consider that this little box is quite clean enough. However, if you really have an extremely high standard of cleanliness, there is a little trick you can do. You simply take a piece of tissue paper and stretch it tightly over the surface of the object, and then what appeared to be perfectly clean suddenly shows up to be really quite full of dirt. This is being highly critical, and for most people would be satisfied with the eye test rather than the tissue test. Silver gilt, or vermeil as it's often called, is very vulnerable to wear. There's no better instructions for cleaning it than those given by the great silversmith Paul de Lamry in the middle of the 18th century. His advice is as good today as it was when given then. Clean it now and then, he says, with only warm water and soap with a sponge, and then wash it with clean water and dry it very well with a soft linen cloth and keep it in a dry place, for the damp will spoil it. This piece happens to be made in about 1840. It carries the arms of the city of Liverpool on the front, suitable heraldic supporters being mermen, and on the top of the cover there is an anchor and a buoy in reference to the maritime or the shipping trade that Liverpool was so famous for. You should note that I'm holding it by the top of the handle and the bottom of the foot. If you're not going to be a purist like a museum curator and use white gloves, try to hold a piece of silver in areas where you will not leave fingerprints. It's very easy to hold it by its extremities and therefore minimize the finger contact to the piece. Silver plate, of course, needs careful, or certainly minimal cleaning if you're not to get back to the base metal on which the plating has been done. This is a French silver-plated canister of the 1810-1820 period, and you can see how the copper is showing through at the corners from constant polishing. Some people don't mind a little bit of bleeding, as this is called. When it gets severe, you have no choice really but to replate the object. When it's got to the point of wear where that decision has to be taken, some of its value has already gone, so it's really up to the individual which step to take. And I'm holding a Moscow beaker made in the 1780s with a generous amount of niello inlay. It's absolutely imperative never to put such a piece in silver dip, as it will immediately react against, it will remove the niello immediately. So a very mild detergent and water should be sufficient cleaning for this piece. It must be very tempting to put your flatware into the dishwasher, but we really can't recommend it. The detergents used are too harsh, and the silver will come out looking very dead white. Also, it's particularly disastrous to put knife handles into the dishwasher, since the blades will separate from them. If you don't mind these problems and insist on using the dishwasher, do at least try to separate your silver pieces from the stainless steel. Remember that silver is a very soft metal, and so obviously you should stay a long way away from things like scouring pads, Brillo, even those double-sided sponges which can be so helpful. Also, please, if you do have to send your silver out to the silversmith to be repaired, do ask him not, as they sometimes still will do, not to put it on to a buffing wheel, a mechanical buffing wheel. This will give it a mirror or even a chromium-like finish, and you will have lost a lot of the charm of the patina that your silver will have acquired over the years of use. If you were going to store your silver, you should take an acid-free tissue paper and wrap the object in that, and then place it in a piece of bubble wrap, which won't, of course, help tarnish-wise, but will protect the piece in case of it jostling against another piece in the storage cabinet or cupboard. And then thirdly, you put it into a plastic or polythene bag. Most people put these pieces into sealed bags. However, that can build up condensation. And if you look at this particular bag, you'll see it's perforated with holes at the sides so that there is always a little bit of air circulating. There are various kinds of cloth which are impregnated to retard tarnish, and all of these are highly to be recommended. They come fitted for flatware, they come fitted for just about every size piece of silver you could ever hope to find. You can, of course, line your flatware drawers with it, and it is an extremely great help in lessening the number of times in a year you're going to have to clean your silver. It's okay to use lacquer for those things not in use at the table, but you really must have it professionally applied. The silver must be scrupulously clean and the lacquer very evenly applied. If it's properly done, it will last for at least 5 years. Curiously, it wasn't until the middle of the 18th century that silversmiths thought of the sensible business of putting a silver bobèche or nozzle to catch the drips from the candle onto the top of the candlestick itself. Thus, before that date, they simply didn't have them, and a few models persisted after that date in not having them either. For such pieces, this is a very handy gadget, a simple glass disc, readily available, and saves a lot of work of cleaning the wax afterwards. Simple glass disc which fits over just below the candle and can be easily cleaned afterwards. Anything that helps keep silver clean and stops you having to polish it is beneficial. And I can strongly recommend putting in the storage cabinet the tarnish retardant strips or cassettes which are now generally available. Camphor used to be used in this way, but the strips are much more successful. If you follow these rules, you will in fact find that you do not have to clean your silver that often. And how rewarding the results can be when you actually come to your dinner table and see it laid out with all the silver in candlelight.
We are now in Sotheby's main furniture warehouse in New York City. Behind me is one section of one floor. Every season, consigned furniture and works of art arrive here to be inventoried and cataloged by our experts. Because of this volume, we are experienced in identifying some of the most common causes of damage to furniture and works of art. In this tape, we have tried to show you some of the basic do's and don'ts of caring for your antiques. We hope you have found this educational and informative.